All right. So, Jason, one, thanks for coming. Two, would you mind giving a brief intro on yourself, your background, and then we can just start the party?
Sure. I mean, if we want to bore everybody right from the start, this is good. Yeah, so I'm an outpatient therapist. I've had a special interest in kind of just loading in general, and tendinopathy management kind of came hand in hand with that. So I've kind of had the luxury of knowing clinical athlete crew and level up for a while now, and been able to go over a lot of different topics when it came to tendinopathy management. And I guess that's a good enough reason for me to talk about why I kind of chose what I did today. In that, if you follow this literature for long enough, you've probably seen the trend where initially it was thought that we were able to have a pretty profound impact on tendon morphology and structure, and have a recently or decent impact on rehabilitation through management of those qualities. And over time, that's kind of degraded a bit, where less and less seems important, less of the structural morphology seems to determine outcomes, which is fine. And there's a lot to go into on that topic, but I wanted to go a slightly different route. Um, if you are familiar with the Hinnemeyer paper back in 2013, and then they had a follow-up paper in 2017 looking at kind of how um, over the lifespan, there are changes in tendon properties that occur early in life, but then pretty much after like late adolescence, you don't see much of anything. So that begged the question, is this something that could be considered something like bone mineral density, where we get our main effects early in life, and that kind of sets us up for the rest of our kind of prognosis long term? So that's an interesting question. And this group, spearheaded by, I probably couldn't have picked a worse group of authors because I can't say any of their names. But this group is looked at this question for the past couple of years in an interesting way. And I just kind of wanted to take a quick look into kind of what's recently come out when it comes to development during early and late adolescence. So I picked a couple from that group, and then the third paper from some guy, the motor control and Achilles adaptation paper. Um, I wanted to give additional perspective just because I didn't want to give all from the same group. You get a lot of the same references, you get a lot of the same narrative flow. So I at least wanted to give a little diversity there. There was a lot more I could have picked and choose to give you guys, but three is already too many, probably too many. And then I wanted to make sure we could just have a discussion around it anyway.
Perfect. So, do you want to give your overall thoughts of the papers, or do you just want to kind of open it up for if anyone has any initial questions?
Uh, I tend to struggle not to show my hand too early on this stuff, so I don't want to go in too deep yet. I want to see, first of all, for those that were able to read these papers and need, just superficial takes on kind of what they found, and what that might have in terms of implications. I know it's hard to talk in a group setting like this, but if anybody's feeling brave enough to kind of like introduce like the general findings, or kind of if that was surprising, or what impression you had from that.
All right, I'll go. Yeah, Jason, thanks for coming on today. Let's just go with that. The last paper you were talking about with the motor control and Achilles tendon adaptation. It was just a longitudinal one. So they basically set it up. They followed these kids. They were basically trying to find it around like the peak growth spurt, basically, in medical sciencey terms. So it was like peak height, basically like the period of, it was like 12 for boys, and around the age of 12 for boys, and then like 11 a little earlier for girls. And they basically measured every 6 months because they wanted to try to capture that window. So they started before, so like a year ahead, and then they followed it for about 18 months after. And so it was longitudinal, and they were just sort of looking at, okay, how well can they control their force output from their lower limb, just in a plantar flexion motion. And then they also did some, it was like diagnostic stuff with like ultrasound measuring like the length of contraction. So findings there was that motor control wasn't different between like athletes and then non-athletes throughout time. It just improved with time. And then, but tendon thickness as well as length was greater in youth athletes. That's all I got.
No, that's good. I appreciate you for doing that, man. And then, yeah, so I guess I can dive in on this. The reason I really like this paper compared to the two by Mersman and that group, the inherent limitations of a lot of the studies looking at this is the nature of the cross-sectional data, right? Where a lot of times they just due to limitations, they take a group and they measure their different characteristics and compare them to a different group without looking at within subject change over time. So that's very important when we're looking at this topic, because realistically, we're interested in the individual adaptations rather than just snapshots of individual groups, right? And then another major confounder in this is that age is just a proxy, because what we're actually interested in is where the actual development of the individual is. So looking at peak height velocity, or basically puberty in their growth spurt, is what actually determines a lot of this rather than their biological age. So that paper had a lot going for it in that regard that I really enjoyed. I guess we should probably look at the main findings of the different ones now and kind of compare and contrast and talk about what that may mean. Did anybody want to talk about the Tendinopathy? God, this is terrible. The 9-year-old, the pre-adolescent paper.
Yeah, I can go. My understanding was that the muscle like morphology isn't changing a ton during this pre-adolescent period, and more of these like tendon adaptations are occurring with pre-adolescent athletes compared to non-athletes. And that's maybe I'm confusing the papers, or maybe there's the similar findings with the Mersman, with like there's less of a muscular adaptation prior to puberty, more of a tendon change, which can affect performance or can be due to the like nature of the training. And then the muscular adaptations tend to like come on board more frequently or more often once puberty hits going forward. Those were my big like understandings. And then like they talk about plyometric training not being like ideal for tendon adaptation.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess across all three studies, there's some consistent limitations that we see in that, one, all these are just simply looking at athletes in sport participation. And they do try to quantify, like some of them have specific strength allocation in that, but like especially the second one, they talk about how all of the training is only body weight. There's no resistance training involved. The first one, obviously, is all sport participation in that young cohort. The last one, I don't even know if they mention it specifically, but it's not at least talked about in terms of deliberate resistance training work. So that's a big confounder to this, right? Because based on our prior data, we know that a lot of the time the sport-specific work, the high velocity, the high loading rate without sufficient time under tension, that's not always sufficient to create any of these changes we're looking at anyway. So that's a huge confounder to begin with. So right off the bat, that kind of throws a wrench into what we can take away from this to some extent. But what you did mention was generally the findings are consistent across all of them. And it's interesting in that what we're looking for is trying to rule out, are these changes that are occurring due to the maturation process itself, or is there an interaction of, does the sport participation, does the loading actually set us up to have greater tendon morphology? Does it set us up to have greater mechanical characteristics that are going to transfer long term? Really the question we're interested in. So at least in this first one, looking at pre-adolescent, it shows there's very little change occurring at the muscle level. There's very little change occurring at the tendon level, but maybe, there's slight baseline considerations. So to me, one thing I'm trying to differentiate across all of these is if, are there selection biases at play? Are individuals who happen to be more, and a lot of these are differences in terms of height, there are differences in terms of body weight, and there are differences in terms of some of the tendon characteristics. Are individuals who have those characteristics, are they the ones who are shoved into sport participation early because they're a little bit better at this kind of stuff in terms of their body morphology, their characteristics? Or is it that the sport participation actually changes this, right? And I think where I'm getting at with picking all these papers is that it's really hard to discern this. Like in the Tendinopathy paper, like you don't really see any indication that anything's occurring pre-adolescent. In the Mersman paper in 2020, the elite athletes in, handball and basketball versus the 10 controls, they're really trying to push this narrative about that, yes, there are changes that occur with sport participation, but it's not at the right rate, right? So like early adolescence, you see more muscular changes and lesser tendon changes. So then that's a problem because that sets us up for injuries down the road, which I definitely want to dive into a little bit because that paper is weird. And then the final one is looking at that, again, that sport by maturation interaction, what we're actually interested in. And that one kind of gives us the most clear answer in that late in the development process here, what we see is that we see a change in stiffness rate change between athletes and non-athletes. So it seems we actually have a significant difference there, which is hopefully due to behavioral and interaction changes. But there's still a lot of confounders there because all this data is pretty messy. I mean, right off the bat, with all of that in consideration, I mean, does anybody have any like strong takes about how this might impact our recommendations for youth athletes, or kind of what prognostically this means for long term?
All right, I'll go. If anyone else, so I just have another follow-up question on this. So because I haven't dived into the research as far as like tendon adaptation over time, like I know obviously with loading you get, like increased tendon stiffness. And so I think about that from like a performance standpoint as, yes, that's good, but I'm just not sure, is tendon stiffness more associated with like tendon injury, or like a tendinopathy? I just didn't know.
Yeah, so that's a good question. One of the papers I didn't give you guys that I probably should have, but I didn't want to overwhelm you, goes into this a little bit more. In that cyclical loading between 4.5% and 6.5% strain, or how much that tendon gets deformed, is seen as the kind of stress you need to have these tendon adaptations. Once you go over 9%, once it deforms that much, that's kind of the area they speculate there's going to be some mechanical breakdown if that's done enough. So you have to have a tendon that's stiff enough to resist the force applied by muscle, so it's not consistently going over that 9%, or at least that's the common thought there. There's a lot of debate that can go on about that. So that's where primarily you want to have these adaptations in athletes who are able to develop a lot more force through their muscle contractions, right? Because if you're contracting at a much higher level and then you're pulling on that tendon, you need that tendon to be able to resist the force enough that it's not chronically being for lack of a better word, overstretched and having a little bit of material breakdown. So that's the big key there. Like, of course, this is a Goldilocks zone where you need that elasticity. You need it to stretch to be able to sufficiently alter the length tension relationship and have those good elastic qualities. But, you know, most of the time what we're looking at is you need that tendon to keep pace with the muscle change.
I have a follow-up question. So why then, like if one of the big roles of a tendon is to like, or one of the values of it is like the stiffer it is, potentially more elastic you can be, or the more like, yeah, the more elastic you can be in sport, why is the training, like plyometric training, not as advantageous as like slower loading and heavier loading, if it's like kind of the opposite from a velocity standpoint?
So some of this has to do with the way we've chronically measured Achilles tendon stiffness and strain, right? So there was a paper in 2021 that looked at mechanical load and elastic strain on the Achilles tendon during walking and running. And basically what they find is that, I mean, prior estimates on how much that thing stretches during plyometric training, it's not nearly as high as they initially thought. And they speculate a lot of the reasoning due to the kind of methods we were using to measure it. So it's not stretching nearly as much as we initially thought. And it doesn't, I mean, and this is due to a couple different properties. I mean, viscoelastic properties, it's got to deal with like the way the load is allocated between the muscle and tendon. But basically that shorter loading duration coupled with the fact that it's not stretching nearly as much as we thought makes it a really suboptimal way to get the stress on the tendon that's likely to derive the adaptation that we want. Now, why do we get the mechanical changes? Hell if I know, man. Like they've looked at this 1,000 different ways. They've looked at, is it cross-linking? Is it change in collagen percentages between type 1, 2, 3, 4? They're not sure. There's no definitive answer yet. Now, within season, they've done some studies looking at changes in morphology, like in season during track, and a lot of elite athletes over the course of a couple of years, and how that kind of affects structure. And they do see, I should mention there's some good military data on this too. There's some data showing that you do have actual changes in the percentage of the different fiber types within the tendon with acute load. Now, maybe that's enough to combat the changes in the force applied to the tendon and change the stiffness. Because consistently what we're not finding is changes in cross-sectional area, right? So that's something that has to be kind of thrown out, and partially why I wanted to look at this, if there's any avenue we can explore where we get changes that are more morphological rather than these kind of weird material changes that are hard to quantify and demonstrate consistently. I really tangented there. I realized that might not have even answered what you asked. But yeah, where was I?
Jason, I have a question.
Sure.
Do you think one issue with the plyometric thing that Chris talked about, how it's the way to load the tendon the most, but the way to have it adapt the least is this paradox that's hard to grasp. Do you think one issue is that we're taking the tendon and trying to kind of look at its changes in isolation versus what's also happening with the muscle and the musculotendon unit at the same time? Because if we're doing plyometrics and improving over time in that we're able to jump higher or produce more force with the same degree of tendon strain, it's able to take more load and not deform. So something is happening, but there's this interplay between the tendon and the muscle tendon unit that's hard to pull away from each other. It's this coupling. So do you think that's one of the issues that we face, maybe, is how we study it?
Yeah, man. I mean, exactly right. When we look at this in a vacuum, it's hard to quantify. There were a couple of interesting studies a few years ago looking at the dynamic and change in length between the muscle tendon unit, and the tendon itself. But that's in kind of slower controlled movements like squats, and the data is really sparse. Like, I think to get a better picture of how this entire unit is functioning, you gotta broaden the scope a little bit, but it's hard to do and it's inaccurate. Like even in the studies I present here, where we're just looking at like really general characteristics, they talk about the difficulty they have with measurement and just trying to get a holistic sense of what's going on. So I think that's until that technology improves, I think it's going to be pretty hard to answer this question. I wish I had memorized that paper on Achilles tendons a little bit better so I could go into why it's not as much strain as they initially thought, but I don't know it well enough. I'm trying to look at it now, but I won't bore you with that.
Is it like tendinopathy for youth? Like it's not really like the terminology really isn't there, right? Like you don't really hear like a kid is having patellar tendinopathy or Achilles tendinopathy.
Well, so
is that the case?
So I mean, you may, and so the group spearheaded by Mersman and Aaron Potts, whatever, their huge contention, and they've written this a few times in a couple different papers, is that they believe the discrepancy between the muscle adaptations that happen early in adolescence and the lack of tendon changes predispose people to having problems. So that theory has been floated out there for a couple of years now by this group. So a lot of times, there's also additional things you mostly see with tendon injuries in this population is at the attachment site. So you see like the Osgood Slaughters and the those kind of injuries. But there was a paper by what's the name? Mogi, maybe? Yeah. Mogi in 2020 that looks at this, and they look at the comparison. The initial theory was that you have a change in length of the long bones, like the femur, and it's not matched by the change in length of the tendon, and then you get this mismatch in force where it's attaching, and then you get things like Osgood-Schlatters disease, right? But that recent paper actually shows that the ratio of change between the length of the tendon and the long bones is actually similar. So you kind of throw that one out, and that's not the responsible reason for why we're getting these pathologies. That's what you mostly hear about. But at least, like I said, this Mersman group is proposing that we would see a significant increase in this type of injury because of this mismatch. Now, one of my huge contentions is that, I mean, hell, I don't see that in the cohort data. Like, if that were the case, wouldn't we have a huge spike in the prevalence of these injuries compared to other groups? And, you know, realistically, I don't see it. I haven't seen it in data, at least anecdotally. I haven't seen it. It's really hard to quantify from at least my perspective, but I don't know. It doesn't really hold up. There was another paper by that same group where they kind of break it down a little bit more specifically across the age span. Early adolescence, which they defined as, where are we at? They define early adolescence as 12 to 14, late adolescence is 16 to 18, and then they compare that to young adults, which they have a wide span of like 20 to 35. And they looked at the changes of some of these characteristics over time. And what they found was that despite their prior hypotheses, they weren't actually supported, because the change in stiffness over time of the tendon, yes, while athletes have absolute higher levels of stiffness, the rate of change between those cohorts didn't matter at all between athletes and non-athletes. So the stiffness was mostly determined by the maturation process rather than the loading environment. Now, again, that's cohort data, that's not longitudinal, and you know, there's no control over what kind of stresses these people are applying. Are they doing what we know we need to do to get mechanical changes? So it's hard to say, and that's why I try to put in that Chala whatever paper to go over that, try to control for those variables too. But there's a lot of uncertainty here, and that's kind of another reason why I picked these, to kind of get other people's perspective, and they've read different things than I have, and kind of see if there's another way to look at it.
Hey, Jason, I have another question.
Great.
Is there still an assumption that let's kind of differentiate between some type of just graded exposure approach? When somebody comes into the clinic with tendon pain, they don't come into the clinic saying, hey, I think I sense that I lack stiffness in my tendon, or that I think I have some tendinopathic changes in my tendon. I can just sense it. They're experiencing the pain. So do we assume that because they're experiencing tendinopathic pain and there's likely some tendinopathic changes, that there is a decrease or a suboptimal state of mechanical properties of the tendon, and then our interventions are specific to mechanical properties of the tendon? Or is that a nice to think and what we thought, and now we're seeing it's not so much like that, and now it's more of a graded exposure approach to whatever loading iterations that they're going to have to do? So is it kind of shifted from that specific mechanical lens, or are we still trying?
I mean, I think some of this comes down to our assessment techniques and how specific we can be, right? Because there's some more interesting data coming out in recent years, particularly in military populations, because I guess that's where the money and funding is for this, is that these structural characteristics, in some sense, can predict people who are going to have problems. Now, the odds ratios are not that big, it's not that consistent, but it's still present to some extent. So if we're just looking at playing the numbers on this, and if we're betting, likely there's something going on there morphologically and mechanically. With that being said, there's no harm in trying to elicit these adaptations if they occur, because a lot of it's going to be going hand in hand with what we're doing from a graded exposure approach anyway. Now, knowing what we know and that it may not be as important, and that some of these results are a little bit more fickle than we like them to be, that probably gives us a wider net we can cast, right? Like for people who don't, like if we're looking at general population, they don't care all about getting under a heavy load. They don't, have opportunity to do that. Hell, I mean, just give them some graded exposure, let them get used to the load, let them psychologically and physiologically deal with it over time a little bit better, and go with it. But in those that have the opportunity, at least in clinic, if not outside of it, to work on more of the morphological changes and the material and mechanical changes, yeah, I'm going to do that along with it as well. But that's just my pragmatic take on it. Like, I don't think there's any harm in doing that with it. I was hoping that this new line of research into kind of the early intervention side, this preventative side, if there's any correlate between the structural phenomenology over time and prevalence of these injuries and resiliency to these injuries over time. But the data is at least not as robust as I'd like it to be if I'm going to make those calls, right? Like where these changes in cross-sectional area are pretty much non-existent across the board when you're looking at the interaction between maturation and sport participation. But I tried.
Well, because we're not measuring the mechanical properties of the tendon in the clinic, we're using a proxy of their just increases in load, external load of
exercise. Yeah, so I mean, I shy away from talking about that too much with the patient because I can't validate it at all, right? Like I can't be like, oh, well, clearly now this tendon is stiffer and absorbing this load in a different way. Like, so I talked about how, for those that are interested in it, I'll talk about how this might be occurring, and so we might want to load this a certain way to get these adaptations. But that's kind of the extent I'll do it, because I don't make any real promises there. Because again, like you said, I can't measure it, so I have no idea if it's actually happening.
What about if you have a patient in clinic who's pre-adolescent or adolescent and has, let's stick with like Achilles tendon pain versus a 18 to 21-year-old, let's say they play the same sport, would you go about treatment differently, or would you think about those cases differently?
It's a good question. I don't necessarily think so. I mean, I think a lot of the same principles apply. I think, how they might adapt to it, trying to look at this data, it might be different based on, the endocrine situation they've got going on in terms of their peak height velocity and their growth spurt and puberty. but I don't think the way we go about it clinically is going to be too different, right? I mean, we're always going to be guided by what they're showing up with, how they're presenting, and then what they're tolerating, and just using that to kind of guide us. So I think that the umbrella of how we treat kind of goes over all of this. I mean, I could rip into these papers a little bit and bore you with why I think they're weird. I don't know if anybody cares about that. I mean, we could talk more about just broad strokes on what the implications could be, or it's kind of up to you guys what you want to get out of it.
If you wanted to go into the Shala whatever 2021, the like concept of measuring motor control, or your thoughts on that with like these tendon properties or changes, like what is motor control like? And I don't know, that just confused me of like, how did they measure it, and then is that changing like their ability to play their sport better, or what's the purpose of it?
Yeah, so that one was a weird one. Hang on, my daughter in the back. Excuse the meltdown occurring upstairs with a toddler. But anyway, it's just interesting in that this is the way they chose to define motor control, is that the coefficient of variation of torque generation. Like, I feel like that's not a great proxy for global motor control. I feel like it's got to be so context specific within what the athletes are trying to do within their sport to say, are you able to control the variation of force you're able to apply is a little bit weird. So I didn't put too much stock in that variable. Like, that one was interesting in that maturation had a much larger effect on that than any sport participation. But again, that can be simply a reflection of what you're asking them to do has nothing to do with what they do on a daily basis in their sport. So of course that motor schema isn't there to begin with. So it's a level playing field. So that's kind of what I view that as. If it was more representative, if it was something like a task specific to what they have to control force in regularly, maybe we'd have a different conversation about it. So I kind of just like bypassed. I was like, weird measure, fine, I guess, but I'm not sure that that's going to impact what I do or think clinically at all.
Yeah, while we're on that, I thought it was a little shaky that like motor control was just, okay, can you control this force output unrelated to a sport? And not only that, like in a super awkward position, it's like prone, not weight bearing, just pressing into a plate, like not exactly anything someone would be familiar with. It's kind of like a awkward position to even then try to be like, okay, this is what the task is. I thought it was kind of weird. And it had nothing to do with like anything related to coordination or, you know, something functional.
Yeah. I mean, I can see why they'd want to look at expression of force and neuromuscular coordination when it comes to like ability to express force, because that's going to have an impact on the total stress you put on the tendon and the eventual strain. But I think it's a weird way to go about it, and I don't think it's reflective of what they're trying to accomplish anyway. So yeah, I just glanced over that one. I was like, all right, whatever.
I had a clinical question just because I listened to the podcast that Quinn had with Steph about she had trouble with one patient that was like a senior skier recovering from ACL. And maybe he can speak on this better than I can because I didn't really understand exactly what went wrong, but it seemed like the athlete wasn't able to, he had too much muscle power that may have caused strain on his knee extensor mechanism. And it kind of just reminds me of this situation where, what if our athletes are developing too much cross-sectional area in their muscles and the tendons aren't responding similarly, that we have prognostic injuries like this in the future. So how could we adapt how we are using our treatment or exercise protocols to make sure that things like that don't happen?
No, that's a great question. And that's really the crux of what Mersman and those colleagues are trying to get at, is the difference in the rate of change between muscle adaptation and tendon, right? Because again, yeah, if we have a change in significant change in muscle characteristics and how much force you're able to apply, it could put too much strain on the tendon if it's not stiffening at the appropriate rate. I guess one, I need to challenge, is this occurring to an extent where we'd have to worry about it? Mersman and those guys have good kind of narrative reviews of why that may be the case. They've got a good argument for that happening, but I'm not sure the data is super conclusive on it. Like in that second paper, they make that argument pretty strongly, but the data is kind of meh, where like they look at tendon cross-sectional area, but they don't have a direct measure of actual tendon stiffness. They look at physiological cross-sectional area based solely on the vastus lateralis volume, which has some weird stuff they do when they're measuring it. But again, they don't have a measure of force production. And so they use this as just a narrative to support that, hey, we're going to have problems down the line. But I don't know that they ever actually measure that directly. And we definitely don't have any data to show that in this cohort with this discrepancy, we see a higher prevalence of this type of injury. So one, I'd really need to see data that this occurs in an ecologically valid way in our individuals, either dealing with injuries or trying to rehab post-surgically. Now, that being said, I mean, it's something that makes sense. That's a dangerous line of thought, but it makes sense. So if that is the case, then we need to look at a lot more closely the rate that these changes occur. And knowing those, we'd probably have to be conservative with the jumps we're making when it comes to force output. Now, you know, that's hard to say, because if we're looking at the athlete in front of us, we should always have some sort of feedback mechanism in place that's guiding us. And we should never be making too big of a jump to begin with when it comes to the stress we're applying on them. So if we're doing a stepwise progression and there's some sort of feedback mechanism in place where we can quickly adjust, like some of these changes should be caught early and should be able to be accommodated for relatively easily. That's easy to say. In a busy outpatient world that a lot of us probably live in, like, you know, it's going to be hard to catch those things. We're not going to get enough touch points with our patients. We're not going to be able to see them for long enough and be this fine tuned. So realistically, that can be a struggle. I would say, you know, have you dealt with this personally at all? Is this just something you heard on the podcast and you were just debating like what you do in that situation?
Yeah, it's what I heard on the podcast. I can't recall anything or any patient that I've seen, but it sounds like Chris is dealing with that right now.
Yeah, I just mentioned to Nick privately that the patient that Quinn and Steph were talking about, like, where I've been watching in clinic, and he's doing much better now. So I can't speak on anything besides that. But I do have a follow-up question. This is more just like out of curiosity, since one, you said you're in like a high volume clinic, and two, you see and research a lot about tendons. Are there any, I guess there's just two questions. One, is there a particular patient in particular that you're really struggling with now that has a tendinopathy that you're like trying to figure out where to go next with them? And then two, is there like a specific tendon that you feel like is just really hard for you to navigate with like a plan of care or with like a progression standpoint?
I guess my most like long-standing tendon patient in my clinic right now, she's a probably mid to late adolescent dancer. So she's been dealing with an Achilles tendinopathy for months now. But the problem is she dances 2 to 3 hours a night, 5 nights a week, and it flares the thing up like crazy all the time. And so it makes it really hard for me to get a good entry point, because that thing's reactive as hell. And like any substantial load, even trying to do things for an analgesic response can easily trigger it. And then the rest of the session is kind of shot, and I just got to work around it. So people who aren't able to modulate their load within their sport, because the dance community here is a little toxic. She's not willing to sit out more because it's going to hinder her ability to progress in her dance. So like, that's a hard situation to navigate. So I'll say that one's been fun. A tendon I don't particularly like working with. I don't love the common extensor tendon in the forearm. That one's just boring isn't the right word, but you know, it's not the most fun for me to work with. And then the physiological cross-sectional area of that tendon is small to begin with. So theoretically, the bandwidth for what it can tolerate before it gets irritated is smaller. People tend to use it more in daily life, so it tends to be a little bit more irritable and harder to get an entry point for load too. Still have plenty of good results from it, but it's just more annoying for me to deal with than anything. And then trying to get compliance on that for, I don't know, maybe it's the area I live, these rich golfers that don't want to do anything but golf, trying to get them to actually go out of their way to do anything else is a pain. So.
Jason, I have a question. I'm struggling a little bit with the idea of like muscle mass to tendon stiffness ratio, or how like that comes into play in adolescence even. Like how much of that is like just simply a strength to body weight ratio? You think of like, you know, kids grow at a faster rate, or like you said, the bone lengthens, or things like that, where there's a greater amount of torque on a joint. And so because of that, maybe a tendon may be unhappy for a little bit, and we just need to find an entry point to movement. Probably like work our way down like a Vermeer's hierarchy, if you will, to like things like strength and compliance first, and then work our way back up. Because I struggle to even think of an example of where I would think of a kid that, I don't know, like maybe I'm thinking of it wrong, but like has, you know, all of a sudden it's a greater increase in muscle mass, and that may be irritating his tendon. Yeah. So.
No, that's a good one. So this the second paper, the Mersman paper, kind of, this was the whole crux of their argument, right? Like the difficulty in this is that, so one, they try to take body weight into account. So they standardize all the data based on that. So when they do the regression modeling, they factor body weight into it, and then they try to look if there's still any significant results. But in this data, like they didn't find any difference whatsoever in anatomical cross-sectional area. So then they kind of pivot, and then they go into, well, hey, the physiological cross-sectional area is actually very different. And then they correlate that with, you know, between the ratio of physiological cross-sectional area and tendons characteristics. But the measurement on that was so weird in that they had different ultrasound scanning units between athletes and non-athletes. They were like, they had to stitch together 3 different images because the field of view wasn't right. And they did it in such a crude way with like fish oil capsules and tape. Like when I was reading that, I was like, what the hell is this group doing? And then so that just introduces so much room for error for me. And then to have your whole argument based around this concept where the p-values were like 0.045, and like to make definitive statements was a little weird. But yeah, and so much of this process with maturation, with these kids growing, it's like they found that the cross-sectional area of the tendon and the muscle were linked. So those individuals who were bigger, they did have bigger muscle mass, they tended to have larger tendons and stiffer tendons. So there seems to be some sort of regulatory mechanism in place already to help them deal with that stress. And then when you look at the interactions over time, while that final paper did find that the rate was slightly better in those athletes who were constantly engaging in the sport, like the biggest determinant is just these kids are aging over time. So for me, I don't necessarily think I've seen it that much. Like I've seen it probably more in my post-op ACLs, where I'm just trying to really build back the quad, and then occasionally the individuals will have that cranky quad or patellar tendon. But to your point, like how much of that is just, you know, that's part of the process. We're trying to build this back up. Like this is somewhat inevitable no matter how we try to regulate it. I don't know. I haven't seen it that much either. And so that's why this argument is fascinating to me, in that it's something they throw out there a lot. Like they use the same thing when they talk about BFR training for tendons. They're like, maybe you shouldn't do it because you're going to create this mismatch and then have all these issues. But I don't think the objective data is actually there to support it yet.
Yeah, it just seemed kind of confusing, and I was like, okay, if the muscle's getting stronger, then my mind inherently thinks that the tendon would get more compliant, and you'll get certain, like you said, just natural adaptations that way. And I just felt like it was a little overcomplicated, and my mind couldn't quite follow the reasoning behind it. But I don't know.
I think to provide some context to the podcast, the scenario was the test to test quad strength was an isometric hold. So you're pushing against a system that's not moving, and you can push as hard as you can and potentially get up to a peak as fast as you can. So that tendon is taking on load really fast and the magnitude's very high. The issue potentially was that the training preceding that test consisted of mostly isometric holds, which is pushing out into a fixed load for a longer duration. So what Steph and I had talked about was that over time, over the course of 6 months, this athlete was just getting his quad back, his leg back. He was, becoming an athlete again, and everything was getting stronger. But when it came to a maximal test at high rate of load and then just high magnitude, that hadn't really been experienced up to that point. And so that was kind of the tipping point for the flare up. And so that's kind of what it looked like clinically, as opposed to just trying to like say, oh, well, the muscle was stronger, therefore the tendon was at risk. It was kind of a system preparation thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's so messy in clinical practice because there's so many covariates in play between physiologically and psychologically dealing with stuff like that. Because when you try to quantify like the actual stress on the tendon, some hysteresis qualities and issues dealing with rate of force development, like the actual change when you're trying to actively apply force quickly versus when you're doing something more plyometric, where it's more of an external stimulus creating the time constraints on you. Like the difference is pretty minimal when you're just doing anything concentrically actively. So like it's one of those things where, yeah, it's a factor. Is it a big enough factor that like it should create that level of problem? I don't know. But it's never a bad thing to still factor in and account for it, right?
JP had a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Did you see that with the dancer?
I just did, yeah. So the question was, what are some ways I've been navigating the treatment with that dancer I mentioned? With her, I mean, honestly, it's so tough because I also think there's some psychological stuff going on with her and her dance troupe where like she's kind of on the out. She doesn't get along with the teachers well at all. They try to push her into situations where she doesn't want. So I think there's a whole mess of factors leading to her chronic sensitivity outside of the physical as well. What I try to do is find situations where I can apply a load in a context where she doesn't deem it as threatening, and that I can manipulate the variables to the point where we can actually get something accomplished. So most of the time I'll have success if I get her in positions where she doesn't go fully on point. When she's all the way up, and it seems to magnify the stress a lot. So just altering the total range of motion is a big one. Of course, the standard things you're going to try, like tempo and then some of the other degrees of freedom when it comes to loading. But I mean, I don't think there's a solid answer that's going to be covering all of our bases. Like for her, like even day to day, like something I try one time will work fine. The next time she'll be flared up. I'll be like, well, looks like we're working more on global strength today and not focusing on that area, because no matter what I try to do, there's not a good entry point. So sometimes you got to be able to pivot.
Yeah, and Jason and JP, just to kind of add on to this, so I was a professional ballet dancer. I started training when I was really young. And so I totally want to reinforce that idea that there's a lot of other layers going on, as far as, I mean, just like with any team, there's, you're being judged from your peers as well as everyone up above you. And so I think it's a really good narrative to provide. Honestly, I wish I got it when I was younger, like that your symptoms are going to fluctuate, and sort of just managing that expectation from the start. Because, okay, maybe you don't have a big flare up for a little while, you think you're going well, and then all of a sudden it hits again. I think had someone sort of like prepped me that this is going to be sort of a longer term thing, not, okay, I took it easy for 2 weeks, I'm feeling good, and I'm going to try to get back to what I was doing before, like that's not going to work either. So I don't know exactly what we can do from like the tissue side of things, but definitely creating that narrative and set the expectation, that would have been helpful for me.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, man, for that perspective. Yeah, so much of what I do with her is specific in her context. I mean, it's been a weird year with COVID. She came to a new school from middle school to high school. She's with this dance studio that the teachers are kind of militaristic in the way they approach it, and she doesn't get along with them anymore. She had a falling out with her school dance team. Like, there's so many factors there where I have to kind of be a clinician rather than just myopically look at, hey, let's get 70% on this tendon, right? Like, so always keep that in perspective too.
Jason, I have a question that's potentially related, potentially most likely not. But we were kind of talking earlier about, it was the Pentidis article or whatever, and they had mentioned the whole like 4.5 to 6.5% strain with like a 3-second loading and then 3-second relaxation, stuff like that. That is somewhat like eerily similar to some of like the tendon neuroplastic training protocols that like people like Ebony Rio and things like that whole sort of Australia crew have been putting out recently. Do you think that there was any relationship to that in terms of like the tendon stiffness as well as like the cortical like inhibition, and then like the whole analogy of like having your foot on the gas and brake at the same time sort of a thing? You get what I'm asking?
Kind of.
I was just curious about like, do you think that there's any relationship, or those are just like that's just like, oh hey, like it was a slow load to a tendon and then something happened?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's awfully convenient that the levels we see where we're getting these cortical changes are the same ones we're prescribing to get these kind of more morphological changes, right? I don't know. I think there's a really wide bandwidth that we get those cortical changes where I don't think there's anything inherently special. I think a lot of it has to do with like, because I saw the same changes whether they were distracted by like a noise, if they're doing it paced on a metronome, if they were just cognitively engaged in other tasks. Like a lot of those type of neurophysiological responses for desensitization, I'm pretty sure happen across a broad spectrum. So I'm not sure that there's anything super specific needed there. So it doesn't really surprise me that it also shows up when we're doing kind of a more slow loading protocol, especially if the person is engaged in actively counting to get that specific tempo. Like that might be enough to create that in itself, right? So honestly, I don't spend a whole lot of time. Like I will early on when they're super reactive to doing to that slow methodical tempo. Outside of that, I kind of ditch that and just move at kind of more self-regulated paces that people feel comfortable with. Most of the time, they're going to regulate that just fine without needing the kind of external stimuli.
Okay, so I just have another quick question about the podcast because I was a little confused too. The isometric test was compared to the other test that was also referred to as, I don't remember what the term was that was used was, but it was called an isometric test too. It was just like a moving isometric test of sorts. So I was a little confused yielding versus overcoming. Anyway, I was a little confused about the other test that it was compared to that differentiated that it was a issue with tendon strength compared to muscle strength.
Hey, Steph on here. No, I'll clarify that, and Jason chime in with what you think in terms of the tendon itself. But the test we were testing knee extension torque was the same type of test at all time points: 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, and it was a seated knee extension isometric overcoming isometric, or an isometric push, where it's you just have a chain attached to a dynamometer. The chain is linked up to something that's not moving. The chain's obviously not moving, and it's a rigid system. So you're just able to kick into that system hard and as fast as you can and produce as much torque as you can. And that's the test. And the athlete got flared up at the 6-month mark of the test. Right after that test, anterior knee pain, patellar tendon pain right after that test. And so what Steph and I talked about was, well, what was the training leading up to that task? Because the task is produce as basically as much as force as that system can handle, and it flared him up. So then our conversation was, well, how prepared was he for that? And so that's when we got into what did the training look like? Well, the training that we did wasn't really those overcoming isometric pushes where you're kicking into something really hard and really fast. It was more of a hold where you kick out at a certain weight and just hold it. That was the training. Or it was like hops and jumps and stuff. But those, you only produce as much force as you need to do the hop and the jump. It's not necessarily maximal. And then other stuff was like squats and lunges, which are awesome, but you're only producing as much force as you need to move the load. So our conversation just kind of stemmed around the training in preparation for that maximal test. If that clears anything up there.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Thank you.
Jason, to throw that to you, you know, it's like, what is it the rate that is a factor that oftentimes we're not looking at or considering, both magnitude and rate of loading?
I mean, yeah, both. Well, first I'll say I'm not surprised at all. Quinn was unclear when he talked. Like, that's just his MO, you know?
100%.
Like, yeah. So second, I think a lot of people make jumps without properly planning on how they're going to build load to that point. Like, a lot of times people have kind of an arbitrary standard where they'll be like, all right, well, we're going to start some plyometrics now, or like not give clear instructions on some of the kind of more intent behind the exercise interventions they're providing. So for me, that's something I'm pretty deliberate on. But again, like, the absolute levels of force and then correspondingly the stress that will occur at the tendon level, how much does that change with these? Within most things we're doing voluntarily under our own power, probably not a ton, but it's still something that I feel like I have control over, so I still pay attention to it. Now, anytime there's going to be more an outside force, like the force of gravity impacting ground reaction force, and especially in a short period of time, I take that way more seriously, and I build up to that. Still probably faster than I should, just because, you know, we're always gung-ho about getting our athletes back to doing certain activities, but it's still something you should probably go slow on and kind of pace it appropriately.
I'm curious how in clinic you have if a patient comes in for an eval and you've identified it's some type of tendinopathy, can you like briefly talk about like how that conversation goes with how you're kind of describing what that is and in like layman's terms to them?
Just generally kind of what the tendinopathy is?
Yeah, like to a patient, and I don't know, obviously it's going to depend on who it is, but I'm sure you kind of have like a rough like framework of how you go about explaining it to make it understanding like to them, and then like how plan of care will look based off of it being a tendinopathy.
Yeah, I mean, I leave it pretty vague. Like I try not to dive into too many specifics early on. Like I'm not trying to flex on my patients and just bore them to death, right? Like so the biggest thing I'll say is that I'll first reassure them to be like, hey, I've checked all this stuff. It doesn't seem like there's anything majorly structurally wrong. I don't see any major like insufficiencies when it comes to your stability. Like all of this is doing really well. All we're seeing is that there's probably something going on with the ability of that tendon to tolerate the load you're applying to it. And they'll talk about how, oftentimes this happens when there's an acute change in total stress on the body. Sometimes it's pretty insidious where, it doesn't seem like much changes, but maybe there's some other factors at play that are dealing with how well we're recovering or some other outside determinants that are leading to this, right? So I'll throw that out there, and then I'll pretty much just tell them that, hey, so what we've got to do now is we have to make sure we can first of all get this thing calmed down so it's not affecting you as much in your daily life. Then gradually that entire system between the muscle and tendon, we've got to be able to make sure you can alter and withstand loads in a variety of settings that you need to. And then so depending on who I'm talking to, I need to frame that around, their sports or their daily life. And then just tell them that most of the time we can see changes in terms of global sensitivity pretty quickly. Like that's going to be something we can affect within a couple, like 2 to 4 weeks. But when it comes to maybe more of the long-standing changes, I still kind of I smooth over the edges of this conversation because I'm not trying to bore them with like the nuances of, hey, do we actually see these changes? What's the magnitude of them? Does it matter? Like I don't get into any of that unless they want to, which 99% of people don't want to. They don't care. So for them, I tell them a lot of times to get these changes to be more profound and stick, we're looking at daily habitual changes on your end that are going to need to be part of the program for probably several months. So I set that expectation up front and try to make sure they understand this isn't going to be, I'm going to stick a needle in you, it's going to go away, and then we're going to get going again, right? Even though I'm very deliberate about doing that, like within a week, people are like, hey, what's the deal? Why aren't I better yet? And then I have to walk through it again. But that's the nature of the position, right?
What about on that day one, someone, let's just stick with like Achilles or patellar tendinopathy, are there objective tests that you're going to do almost consistently for like an Achilles tendinopathy or a patellar tendinopathy, or does it depend on their sport and how they're presenting?
I don't get too sport specific until a little bit later. Like it depends on the reactivity, right? So like early on with an Achilles tendinopathy, for example, can they tolerate a single leg heel raise, just even from neutral, right? If they can do that, then I'll probably do an endurance test to see kind of how their muscle strength is comparatively and their strength endurance is comparatively. From there, it depends on how quick of a turnaround we need. If that's all fine, then I'll mess around with tempo and then do repeated like kind of ankle hops. You can do that for kind of time durations or until symptom provocation and see kind of where they stand on that front. I don't usually do this on the first day, but then you can always take them through some sort of objective testing when it comes to if you have the capability to load them in clinic, that's cool. You can try that. If you want to do more of just general like hop testing to see, first of all, psychologically, how resilient are they on putting that kind of load on that tendon, and then physiologically, how they're performing when it comes to how is our total power output, how is the athlete moving, kind of are they doing offloading strategies, like that's what I'll step it through there. You basically just want to find the level that you can elicit some sort of asymmetry and then show them that there's that asymmetry and then come up with a plan to be like, hey, we need to address this by doing this. You can always get more sport specific too. Like if you can't elicit it within that, I mean, dive in on the task analysis of what they need to be able to do and why they're coming to see you. Like if it's just pain, then I just tend to go, pretty general with that whole spiel I gave and then just start building capacity generally. But almost always when that comes along, you'll find some sort of problem associated with it that you can be more objective about.
I just wanted to share a patient case that I had on my 6-week clinical. He was a high school athlete, and he had, I'm pretty sure it was bilateral anterior tib tendinopathy. And it was kind of tough because, you know, I came in, fortunately it wasn't too far along in his treatment. It was probably like 3 weeks in or so. And my CI gave me free rein, but I didn't know how to organize my test retest, especially the tendinopathy, because I never learned anything about that. And that's kind of what you guys are getting at right now. And I remember it was just a huge lesson learned because, you know, I wanted to see how he ran because I knew that's kind of what brought on his symptoms. He was a basketball player, and I just had him run for a minute on the treadmill, and he had this severe foot slap. And it made sense, but it also didn't make a lot of sense because he had been a long time track athlete as well, plays basketball. So I was like, is it really his biomechanics that is, you know, is he always running around with a foot slap? Probably not. It's probably just because he's irritated. But then I kind of used that as my way to measure, you know, his improvement. And it was difficult to load the anterior tib in a way that, you know, is relative to a sport. And so I found running as like the best way to do that in the clinic. And he was definitely reactive. And so I kind of got him to that point where he wasn't having continuous symptoms the day after therapy. And then I progressed him to, you know, light plyometrics, but then he came back in the next day and was flared up. And it was a tough, you know, back and go with trying to progress into plyometrics and then finding like that balance. So I don't know if you have any suggestions on, obviously it's very dependent on the tendon, but, you know, creating some sort of organization within your testing for tendinopathy.
No, so one, I like your thought process in that when you were looking at the athlete, you didn't automatically attribute cause. You're like, well, obviously because he's doing foot slap, this is the problem, right? You explored like, well, maybe this is just because it's reactive. So that's always a good thing. Keep thinking like that because it's too easy to get in your own head and get confident in kind of diagnostic things like that. And second, I mean, if you know what he can tolerate, if you've seen the constraints that the individual does well with, and you know exactly what flared them up, spot the difference. So like look at the mechanics of what they were doing when it came to the light plyometrics, look at the demands on the tissue when it comes to that, and dissect a little bit out in terms of what you can find and recreate to train to. Because now you've got your end goal, you got to be able to tolerate this type of plyometric, dissect what we need to do to get there. So a lot of times it comes down to understanding the biomechanics behind the plyometrics and the forces that you're going to be dealing with, and then using that to kind of reverse engineer what the goal is.
Dope. Maybe if anyone has any like last minute questions, if not, we can wrap it up. Or any last thoughts you have, Jason, about like takeaways from the paper or just more kind of like more questions than answers?
Yeah, I mean, I just, again, I brought this up is I thought it was an interesting line of questioning, whether this is something we can eventually have a more pronounced impact on, if we can have a societal change, if this does pan out to build up a little bit more resiliency, both in terms of bone mineral density and soft tissue structures like tendons, if we can promote early activity in certain areas. You know, I think there needs to be a lot more data, whether that is more things directed directly at the tendons to get the adaptations we want, whether this is, you know, more cohort level data or longitudinal data within individuals to show that these changes actually happen. I think there's a lot more steps that have to come, but at least this is something that's starting to be looked at that I think is interesting. You know, time will tell. I'm sure this is just kind of the groundwork in the early phases before they get to that kind of data. But I thought it was good to be aware of that this is something that's going on. that's all I really got. I mean, nothing too crazy.
Sounds good, man. Thanks for presenting on it. And yeah, I think a lot of the times these talks end up just being less of like a heart specific answer or direction. It's like the exact opposite, which is totally fine.
Yeah, it'd be nice if I was like, well, yeah, this is the answer, right? But unfortunately not.
Yeah, for sure. But thanks again, man. Have a great weekend. Have fun fighting the cicadas.
Yeah.
Yeah. But thanks everyone else for joining the party.
Hey, thanks for showing up, guys.
Yeah. All right. You'll have a good one. Bye.
See ya.